Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacob Davey. I'm a senior research manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. We're an organisation based in London who works to counter hate, extremism and polarisation. And my specific role at the Institute is the lead on all of our research into the extreme right. But underneath that, I have also helped develop processes and responses for identifying and responding to hate speech. I guess today, what I'm going to touch upon is the way we see hate speech unfolding online, to try and pinpoint, why it's harmful, which is still, I think, an important question, and then to go into some of the responses which we've seen, both at a policy level, but then also at a practical level as well. So I guess the first question, what is the impact of hate speech? And I'm actually often surprised the amount of times in which I'm talking about this, particularly with journalists, where I get a so what? Like, so what? People are nasty online. People say shitty things to each other. So what? I think it's actually an important thing to unpick, because actually a lot of people still don't necessarily see hate speech as a real, genuine threat. So really, if you think about hate speech in general, I think there are three really key areas where it is truly harmful, truly damaging. And I think these are things which should be definitely be kept in mind as we work to respond to them. So first of all, and I think this is the clearest area, is a physical threat. Hate speech poses a threat both to the physical safety and psychological safety of targeted groups. It really is. It makes people feel unsafe, it makes people feel unwell, and the presence of hate speech can actually predicate incidents of attack and violent attack against individuals. Online hate speech, particularly as we see it, and its presence can help normalize this behavior. It can create cultures, areas of the internet where hateful attitudes against other people become the societal norm, as we've just heard now through, for example, 4chan. And this itself can have a radicalizing effect. It can generate whole communities which not only feel this way, feel hateful attitudes towards individuals, but then actually can encourage them to go out and engage in attacks themselves, to promote more hate speech, to radicalize other individuals. And finally, its presence can influence a range of behaviors, including serious crimes. So there's a wealth of documentation around media environments and hateful language leading up to genocide, seriously. For example, looking in Rwanda. And there has been recent research which points to the fact that increased presence in online hate speech can correlate to increased violence against minority communities. So I'll go into some research now which just points through and talks through some of these harms before getting to what can we do about this. So this slide shows some research delivered by our research partners at the Institute, the Centre for Analysis of Social Media, CASM, through a tool which we are now co-developing, which tracked online hate speech targeting Muslims. And what they did was they were able to overlay this with instances of offline hate crime in London. And they found a correlation between the two. I believe similar research has recently been published by Cardiff University. And likewise, there's been some research in Germany looking at anti-migrant conversation on Facebook and increased incidents in anti-migrant attacks in various areas. So I think it's really important to understand that when we're mapping online hate speech, we're not just looking at a phenomenon which exists in a vacuum, right? We're actually looking at a barometer for the generalized value system of a particular group, culture, society, and we can see instances of hateful attitudes targeting individuals grow. So the next area is the normalization of hate speech. And I again have a Pepe the Frog. I wonder how many times this will pop up. But essentially, if you create societies, if you create online cultures where hateful rhetoric is normalized, this itself can have a fairly significant impact on the growth of radicalization and extremism. So in the case of 4chan, we see a community where initially sort of transgressive behavior was eroded through activity on the B random image board. as it sort of grew and as the politics board, politically incorrect board grew, it created this whole subculture which reveled in the hatred of others, which reveled in the targeting of hatred, and which ultimately started to seek ways to push this out, as we've heard, through raids on YouTube, but also through the creation of material to try and make other people feel the same hatred. This is called, in the alt-right lingo, red pilling. So we actually see that as these communities grow, which revel in hatred, they then seek to transpose that idea to allow their hatred to grow more broadly in society. And this itself then connects and ties into the recent explosion of white supremacist terrorism, which we've seen. I think finally, if we look about hate speech in general, we can think about how it's more broadly weaponized. So hate speech has been deployed in a targeted and coordinated fashion as part of this tactical playbook which extremist organizations deploy. At ISD, we are running a range of election monitoring projects seeking to analyze malicious activity in the context of elections. So this includes disinformation campaigns, but also more broadly coordinated harassment. I'm currently doing this for the UK general election, but this recently we did a project looking at the EU parliamentary elections. We were looking at the UK, Poland, France, Germany, and Spain. And what we found was in all of those areas, hate speech was deployed against candidates and elected officials in all of these countries with the deliberate intent of silencing these individuals. What we also found was often this mobilization had a close relationship with mainstream political discussion. So it didn't necessarily exist in a vacuum. It wasn't necessarily just people sat on 4chan going, okay, who can we harass? Who can we harass now? Who can we go and troll? Activists, if you want to call them that, took their cues from the rhetoric in the political mainstream. So when a certain MP or a certain candidate was attacked by their preferred candidate, in particular, for example, Salvini in Italy, what we saw was this had a direct relationship with targeted harassment. Similarly, we often saw that disinformation and the proliferation of hate speech were often linked. So disinformation itself and disinformation material is often created to agitate across what we call wedge issues. So in the current UK election, for example, we're seeing this playing out around questions of Muslim voters, for example, where people identify these sort of wedge issues, put out disinformation around these questions, which then picks up and then generates extremist mobilization and harassment. And I think this has a really direct effect and impact on our democracy. So in the UK, we found that 41% of female BAME MPs have been subject to online harassment. We find in general that online harassment disproportionately targets women and particularly women of colour. And this has an effect of inhibiting democratic engagement. It corrupts our political discourse. But more importantly, it puts individuals who are taking part in democratic debate and the democratic process at risk. It seeks to target them. It seeks to silence them. I know researchers and journalists who have taken their online presence down as a result of this harassment. And this is often done in a coordinated fashion. I'm sure many researchers in the room have experienced this if you've put out reports looking at the extreme right. I know that I have. These coordinated hate and trolling campaigns are designed to try and silence you and to try and, as a result, to enable a situation where hate and extremism can continue to grow. So what can be done? I think there are a few different areas which we can look at. And again, I'm not going to say here that there are any silver bullets. I'm not going to say that we have the solution, right? I think I'm in line with everyone where actually there are more challenges than successes at this stage. First of all, we can look at regulation. So in Germany, the 2017 NetzDG law was put in place to try and compel social media companies to remove illegal hate content, and they gave them a 24-hour window to take down hate speech or risk very hefty fines. Now, That was all very well and good, but that didn't have any sort of judicial overview. Essentially, it put the power in the hands of social media platforms to decide what was and wasn't illegal, which as a result means that there could be very little transparency in those processes. Similarly, we've had the UK Online Harms White Paper, which has recently been published. Now, this sort of lays out, I think, a promising direction of travel, but with some caveats. It introduces a duty of care for platforms for their users, and an independent regulatory body. But again, the plan here itself isn't very clear. At the moment, there isn't a clear pathway for how this can necessarily be achieved. And there are still questions and problems there with the definitions which are in place. So actually, I think what I'm trying to get here is that regulation itself is still very thorny. We're still in the infancy of regulation. People are still only making sort of baby steps towards this. And I don't think that, that we will be in a situation where we have sort of effective regulatory policy introduced for a number of years yet. So where else can we go? We also have responses to social media platforms. And this has been picked up on a couple of times, I think. So we have these sort of statistics and things which come out. So Facebook has removed 7 million pieces of content in the last quarter of this year. Or detects 80% of its hate speech proactively. We have this infrastructure in place, but I would argue that these sorts of headlines aren't necessarily helpful at allowing us to get to the grips, get to the crux of the problem at hand. Ultimately, there's still very little transparency around the process, around the regulatory processes which are employed by the platforms. For example, we don't know the scale and nature of user reports against hate speech, or indeed how they're fully acted. And I think that means that essentially what we have is a situation where the platforms are marking their own homework at the moment. Similarly, we can try and monitor hate speech online, but we can only do that if we have access to data. Now, we can't currently access user data on Facebook. I don't want to get into the weeds there, but that means that there is no way for us to independently assess or evaluate the scale of hate speech on the platform. We have to go with what they say they've been taken down. And that, as a result, that means as researchers, we're essentially sort of making our recommendations based on anecdotes. We're saying anecdotally, oh, we found X pages which contain hate speech still, even though they've been taken down. But we haven't been able to actually effectively and systematically evaluate the scale of hate. So what can civil society and researchers do? There are tools which we can deploy which allow us to identify hate speech at scale. We've already heard about a few people in the room doing this, and I won't go into too much detail because of time, but this is something which ISD is doing as well. This is in partnership with the Centre for Analysis of Social Media, and we developed a resource which allows us to identify hate speech at scale. We're able to get certain trends, for example, to identify when certain communities are at risk of being targeted by hate speech. In this instance, we're looking at anti-Muslim hate speech, and we can see the prevalence of how these communities are at risk of being targeted following terrorist attacks. Similarly, this is some data from the UK, which we will be publishing shortly, which essentially looks at anti-Muslim context in the context of the UK. And again, we can see that it's not just terrorist attacks which have been perpetrated by Islamist-inspired groups, which generate hate speech against Muslims. This large spike here actually correlates to the Christchurch attack. And so what we actually saw was that following Christchurch, that actually encouraged and emboldened people to go out and engage in anti-Muslim hate speech online. Now, I mean, this is just one part of the problem, and there are a lot of challenges here. But I feel through effectively measuring this, then we can make more informed recommendations around how to counter it, and also know when to offer support to communities. I mean, we've had the limitations touched upon, but just to run into them. Through mapping and measuring hate speech online, we still have a number of limitations. We don't have necessarily useful or common shared definitions for hate speech. When identifying it online, differentiating between targeted hate speech and the generalized use of hateful language is still a challenge. Maintaining context-specific and accurate algorithms is still a massive issue. So I've mapped hate speech targeting Muslims in Australia and hate speech targeting Muslims in the UK. We had to build two different processes for that due to the way in which certain types of language and language use is normalized in Australia and isn't normalized in the UK. Similarly, we have to recognize the bias within these algorithms and the bias of our researchers and the people who are training them. And also, fundamentally, this approach relies on access to data. If we only really have good access to Twitter data, we're only going to be able to measure certain types of hate speech. What else can be done? And I'm conscious I have 1 minute, so I'm going to be very quick. We can deploy counter-speech. Counter-speech is employed widely by civil society actors. This is encouraging people to speak up and speak against extremists and hateful rhetoric to offer a positive alternative to this sort of divisive language. There are challenges there as well. There are huge challenges in evaluating the efficacy of this, right? We don't necessarily know if it works, and in some instances we can actually identify examples where it doesn't work and where it's counterproductive, and so we still need to be building frameworks to assess that. Similarly, however, if we're thinking about positive speech online, there's still a massive discrepancy between the scale of extremist speech and the scale of positive speech, and indeed in the coordination of those efforts. Whilst we'll see people sitting in Discord servers or sitting on 4chan saying, okay, let's attack and harass these people at this time, we don't have the same infrastructure for positive counter-speech and for countermeasures. Finally, education. So we have seen some positive results in actually building education and building curricula which help raise awareness amongst young people around the risks of hate speech. At ISD, we've been building models which actually promote civility and promote civic culture. So not only encouraging people to recognize why hate speech might be wrong, but actually providing them with knowledge around how they can respond effectively. But again, that is only one part of the problem. If you think about disinformation, the majority of the people who put it out are actually adults, not children, right? And so we need to think more broadly about how can we actually reach the adults who are perpetrating and committing this activity. Because if we're just speaking to classrooms, that's again going to be only one piece of the puzzle. And with that, and slightly over time, I will leave you.
Great, thank you.